Hello, this is Mike Regan, and we are delighted to host you on this industry insight session for the Manufacturing Excellence Network. We got a ton of stuff to cover, so I'm going to be uncharacteristically brief. The over-under on my comments is 2 minutes, and people are betting on the over. I'm going to disappoint them and come in under because we have some great resources. We have Derek Leathers, who is joining us in what is his first official non-Werner event as both the chairman and the CEO of Werner Enterprises, which is one of the largest truckload carriers in North America. We also have Peter Tershwell, who is a vice president with IHS Markit and writes for the Journal of Commerce, and is their ocean expert. And then we're delighted to welcome back David Simchi-Levy, a professor from MIT, who is really, for my money, the best in terms of addressing supply chain disruptions and supply chain issues. So what we'd like to do is just welcome you here with a couple of opening slides so that you understand the magnitude. One of the things we want to highlight for you on this next slide is what's going on in the transportation industry. Derek, David, and Peter are going to address those comments, but there's a chart that we sent out ahead of this to you, which is intended to help you understand what's going on with the transportation industry. This is from our friends at truckstop.com. And those blue bars recognize the volume that's going through the freight system in the United States on a weekly basis. What's particularly noteworthy is it also has 4 different trend lines going back to 2015. 2018 was considered to be a very, very strong year for freight. And this year, we are already running ahead of 2018. So if you take a look at that, there was 8.2 million loads moved on the spot market, the boards there, in week 18. And the scary thing about this is if you look at those trend lines, folks, it tells us that we haven't yet hit our heaviest period for freight, which is coming up in weeks 23 to 30. And so what that means is that if you're having a hard time getting freight moved now, it could become even more challenging. What's noteworthy is that the spot rate topped $3 for the first time ever last week. And what an index, which we don't have time to discuss, the market demand index, was over 200, which means it's really tough to find freight trucks to move your freight. Something else that's very important to note is thus far this year, we're moving about 80 to 90% on a month-by-month basis comparative against a 5-year average. What does that mean for shippers? It means that the market is red hot. And one of the things that has is we're going to be talking about this after we go through their comments here, is how you can address this and some of the strategies that you can use to manage through this. So briefly, one of the things we hope you'll stick through the entire call because we have these strategies as well as we want to share some other important information about MXN events. But I'd like to have you listen to Derek Leathers as he shares his insights on what's going on in the trucking market. So Derek, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate being here. Appreciate having the opportunity to speak with everyone today. I'm going to focus my comments really on the truckload side of the business because we've got other experts that'll be weighing in on ocean and other modes. But as you've mentioned, it's been the most volatile ride over the last year that I've seen, and I've been doing this for 30 years. Been at Werner for 22 years, and driven by kind of a confluence of issues around what we first saw early in the pandemic. Was obviously the accelerated purchasing of essential goods. What that did to carriers across the country was shift their networks out of balance. And so we found ourselves waking up in an environment where our networks were simply not operating as efficiently as they once did. And yet demand was at a higher level, not lower early in the pandemic because of the amount of essential goods that we're moving. We do a little over 3 million miles a day of freight transportation. We're predominantly retail, meaning working with retailers. That's over half our book. So we're very exposed to what's happening as consumers have shifted their buying habits from services into products. And we've seen a heavy increase in same-store sales of everything from home improvement to discount retail to to all of the things that people have purchased in lieu of being out in the economy, participating in concerts, ball games, et cetera. That's driven inventory levels down to historic lows. We track inventory levels across 20 of the largest retailers in America. And if you aggregate that data, they're at the lowest levels they've been in over 20 years. At a time that stimulus money is flowing into the economy, and at a time the consumer is even further engaging. And now we see GDP growth drifting from 3 to 4 to 5, and now most estimates are at 6% plus. That's another way of saying there's really no end in sight. And so the obvious question that always comes up is, well, why don't all the truckers just grow? And the honest answer is we can't. We issued guidance this year coming into the year of 1 to 3% fleet growth. We're actually -1 at the end of Q1. And that's driven by the reality of how hard it is to find drivers in an already constrained market. It's added to by the reality that OEMs are struggling to produce equipment to get finished trucks out on the road on time and on schedule because of the underlying chip shortage that everybody's very well aware of. That's the predominant issue. But there's actually 15 other components that go into a truck that are in various stages of shortage right now. And so we can't get equipment. On the driver front, wages are increasing rapidly. And in our business, we've added about $69 million of wage increases over the last 3.5 years into the network. Our average driver wages at an individual per person level, is up about 20% over that time frame and climbing from there. And with all of that said, you had such an increase in retirements of older drivers during COVID and such a decrease of new drivers entering the market during COVID because of school closures nationwide. Many governors, when they closed schools, were thinking about academic schools, but they didn't realize their very same closure orders affected and impacted trade schools, truck driving schools, and other things. And so we had a 40% decrease in new entrants, coupled with about a 10% increase in exits of drivers that retired due to concerns about the pandemic. These folks don't get the option of working from home. They got to work in the seat and in the economy. You put all that together, and what the reality is capacity is far below where demand levels are right now. Carriers are working aggressively to try to augment their capacity capabilities by adding more engineered lanes and teams, looking for efficiencies. And what they're actually finding is inefficiencies that they're faced with. As people go back out over the road now, transit times are slowing. So we saw a noticeable increase in transit capabilities during COVID, followed by now a noticeable decrease week over week, month over month, as people start going back out on the road. Personal vehicles is what I'm referring to. The other decrease, where you can help yourself a lot with this capacity shortage, is making sure you don't let it leak into your plants and your dock level efficiencies. We're seeing tons of equipment sitting idle at docks because everybody's faced with the same labor problem. We get it, we empathize with it, we understand it, but when those trailers are tied up and not being unloaded, that's one less trailer I can offer to the next customer out there. And so we've added to our trailer pool, but seen our efficiency decreases in terms of trailer utilization more than offset the adds we've been able to make. So that's an additional layer of concern. And the last one is the ongoing stimulus. We are all, in my opinion, collectively competing against the government to try to hire labor and try to hire people. And it is an active competition right now. And we find that very, very difficult out there trying to add people. Despite all that, we got through it fairly well. We had a very strong year. And so far this year is shaping up well. But we know that the only way to serve our core customers is to rally around them. So it's a very difficult time to accept new entrants into the portfolio. And that's nothing that a business ever wants to see. We certainly don't like it here. We're working hard for that not to be the case, but really the only way to do it is to displace existing business and or not live up to a commitment with a customer that we've made. And that's just not in our DNA. With that, I'll stop because I think we have breakouts and other things later to go into more detail, but that's kind of a lay of the land as I see it.
Derek, thank you very much. I just want to clarify for everyone here, after the resources are done, what Derek was alluding to, we're going to give you instructions on how to get into the breakout rooms where Derek is going to have some more information. Derek, can I ask two questions, though, that you mentioned? And that is, you alluded to this when you said we restrict new entrants into our portfolio. What you're saying is you're not out there aggressively seeking new customers that have not yet done business with Werner. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, I mean, look, we want to be in those conversations and dialogues. I'm just being honest and frank about how hard it is right now to onboard new business when the groundswell of existing business is such, and the inventory replenishment needs of existing customers are such that you, unless I can add drivers and I can add capacity, or I can find increased efficiencies at the dock level with customers we already have, we've never really seen a circumstance where we're having to be as selective as we are right now. And I think I speak not just for Werner, but I think that's an industry thing right now. And what it is not is because we're chasing the spot market. We publicly disclose our spot market data, and we had less trucks in the spot market in the first quarter than any first quarter in the prior 15 years. So we were standing by our commitments and serving our core customers.
And just as a point of reference, Derek, one of the things that and I want to emphasize, what you're saying is not just for Werner, it's everybody.
That's right.
In the LTL sector, Rob Estes was on our last industry insight session. We've got several LTL carriers that have announced that they are not accepting new RFPs from new customers. Just to give the audience a perspective, I was on the Journal of Commerce, Peter's Journal of Commerce TPM conference with the CEO from CFI, which is a large truckload carrier, about 800 million. They got $6.6 billion worth of bids in 2020. And he was saying that allows us to be much more selective than we've ever been. And so hopefully in the breakout room, you'll be able to address the carrier fit factor as you and Gail kind of flush that out. What's important for the people on this call is to understand how your freight fits within your network. Is that kind of an accurate summation?
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. And I think when you think about networks, there's never been more focus at all carriers on trying to make sure that as they look at freight, they're trying to find freight that fits into the network, that is additive to the network, because it allows us to ensure the level of service that customers are looking for. If it's far-flung freight that's outside of the network, we're going to use our logistics arm and try to find a different carrier that maybe has that in-pattern move to be able to service that particular lane.
So if you have, for the members of the MXN here, Derek had said something on one of our calls here, pre-calls, is that, he's got a $75,000, $80,000 a year driver that's getting hung up by a $17 an hour person at your dock, which is why it's important to have efficient docks to clear the equipment. I think that's accurate, isn't it, Derek?
Yeah, that's accurate. Yeah, and we understand the labor constraints, but it is what it is. But we've got to get the docks flowing again and back to the levels of efficiencies.
Well, let's switch over to the ocean market where there's excess equipment, excess capacity. Ocean rates are at historic lows and other fantasies. So Peter, walk us away on what's going on in the ocean market.
Well, I think, Mike, that there are plenty of people on this call who would wish that the market would be exactly as you described it, but it is in fact precisely the opposite. And picking up off what Derek was saying and describing in the trucking market, you could see a similarly challenged, stressed, indeed almost unprecedented situation playing out on the ocean space. I think that the headline in the first slide, Mike, that you presented really says it all in the ocean arena. Too much freight, not enough capacity. And when you look at capacity in the ocean space, you have to really start with three components: ships, containers themselves, and the chassis that the containers move on. And if you were to look at the ships, you could say that there aren't enough ships. The order book of, in other words, the percent of ships on order relative to the existing fleet. In other words, if the existing fleet is 100, there's 10% on order. That had been as high as 50% back in 2007. It had gone down to 10% by 2020. In other words, there was a long, consistent slowdown over nearly a decade and a half in vessel ordering. And the vessel ordering has picked up recently over the last couple of months. You've seen a number of major vessel orders be placed by some of the major ocean carriers. The problem is those ships aren't going to show up for 3 years. And so the overall supply of vessel capacity in this year is going to be less than 4%. Next year, it's going to be even less. It's going to be just over 2%. And in both cases, that's well below what the overall container demand is expected to be. And you can see this in things like container ship charter rates. So if you're a shipping company and you want to go charter a container ship, you're paying roughly triple the rate that you were paying a year ago. There are no ships that are idled at anchor with no employment. They simply don't exist before. Scrapping has come to a near halt because every one of the vessels that's out there is being called into service. Then you look at containers themselves. The issue there primarily is the fact that containers aren't circulating at nearly the rate that they did before. So in normal times when freight flow is more or less on an even keel, containers are delivered to a distribution center or delivered to a cross-dock facility, and pretty quickly they're unloaded and returned back to the ocean carrier, or they're turned over from an importing company to an exporting company. Well, for various reasons, including everything from productivity within warehouses being lowered due to COVID restrictions to distribution facilities being just chock-a-block with goods, the containers are sitting loaded for much longer than they did previously. And as a result of that, this sort of like what you might call a global circulatory system of containers themselves all over the world has slowed. And when that happens, it reduces the effective capacity of the container fleet itself, not the ships, but the containers. This has been a big problem. And what you also has taken a while to ramp up is new container manufacturing. Almost all the containers are built in China. And so China went into lockdown, and then they've been sort of slowly, rebuilding production. But even then, even though the production cycle is considerably less than it is for ships themselves, as you can imagine. Nevertheless, the pace of production is not what it needs to be. Then, if you look at chassis themselves, China makes most of the chassis. Also, there are some chassis that are built in North America, in Mexico, and here in the U.S. But we talked to one of the major chassis leasing company executives about a week ago, who told us that the number of new chassis, or let's put it this way, the fleet of marine chassis in the U.S. is only going to grow about 2% this year. 2%. We've had double-digit container import volumes for the past 8 months, and now the consensus view among ocean carriers, among freight forwarders, among marine terminals, all the people we talk to who are connected with the ocean space are all saying that this incredibly busy period that we're seeing right now, due to the growth of e-commerce, due to the economy projected to grow north of 6% in the United States this year. This is going to be the fastest economic growth that we've seen since 1984, due to stimulus checks, due to a lot of heavier savings, due to lockdowns beginning to ease, but still a great deal of consumer spending still going on. That is likely to bleed right into the traditional holiday peak season, which typically in the ocean space begins in July, August time period and runs well into the year. And then of course in the trucking space, you guys see the peak season a little bit later in the game. And so therefore we just heard Maersk the other day, the largest ocean carrier, basically saying that the conditions are going to be stressed for the balance of this calendar year. So I would like to be able to say, hey, great, things are hunky dory. I'd also be able to like to say, well, there are some easy solutions here. There are some ways out. There are some things that you can do, but it's very difficult to identify what those might be. I mean, one of the things, for example, Mike, and I'll finish up with this because I have a feeling that I'm already running up against my time.
You're good. You're good.
The one thing that we have seen a consistent growth of, and it continued this year, is customers turning to the intermediaries, turning to the freight forwarders, or in the U.S. sometimes they're called NVOCCs. Why is that? Because they have access to capacity they aggregate capacity. They have fairly significant buying power with the ocean carriers. They have contracts with all the ocean carriers. And so the name of the game right now is obtaining capacity. The price is thrown out the window for many customers. I mean, if you look at where rates were a year ago versus where they are now, we're talking in many cases 5, 6, 7 times higher than it was. I mean, staggering freight rates, the likes of which, sort of grizzled old veterans like me haven't seen really ever in our careers. So there's one potential opportunity to get access to capacity. I don't want to bore you at all with this whole, thing. Oh, you got to build good relationships with ocean carriers, blah, blah, blah. I mean, yeah, for sure. But I will say this is that the market has fundamentally turned in this. And in the ocean space, you have to look at it not just in terms of the current situation that we're seeing, but you have to look at it in the sense that over the past 5 years, there has been a significant, I would even dare say, historic consolidation in the ocean carrier space. So the number of major ocean container carriers plying the east-west trades has shrunk from 20 down to 10. So significant consolidation that has occurred. The other thing that has happened is that the carriers came together into 3 major carrier alliances. And the reason why that's important is that over the last couple of years, sort of slowly kind of outside of the limelight, those alliances became agile operating entities, in the sense that almost for the first time that anyone can remember in the ocean carrier space, they are now able to flex capacity in response to short-term changes in demand and do it quickly. One of the big problems that occurred in one of the reasons why there was such a huge shortage of capacity back in 2010 during the restocking following the financial crisis was that the carriers did not pull out capacity fast enough and they didn't replace it fast enough. Well, that completely changed, because no sooner did the lockdown occur in North America a year ago that the carriers did something that they had never done before, which they withdrew massive amounts of capacity, and they did it almost overnight. And the message to the market is that whole way in which the business operated before, where there would be overcapacity, rates would go down, then if the period it gets tightened a little bit, rates would go up, that there's going to be much more effective calibration of supply relative to current demand. And that's going to change the nature of the market potentially in a fundamental way. So it's a very different environment in ocean. In the breakout room, we can talk a little bit more about that to the extent that you would like to.
Okay, so I got 3 things, and Derek, please pay attention on this in your breakout room as well. I heard from some people ahead of this call, when I tell them, under Code Red, Gail runs NASDAQ, does a great job. We sponsored we did some Code Red webcasts. The question that some people ask is, you guys are carriers, you folks are carriers. How the heck do you run out of equipment? How do you run out of containers? How do you run out of chassis? How do you run out of trucks? Like Derek, how come you just don't add, pay more and get more and this type of thing? And that seems to be something that people need to understand, because 2 words that the members of this MXN are going to have heard or will hear: the impact of blank sailings, where the carriers cancel a run. You also, in one of our interviews that's available over at transact.com, I encourage everyone to listen to it. You talked about the issue of ghost bookings, okay? Ghost freight. And, Derek as well, that's something to address. I could go on, but, that leaves us into the area here where, David, if you could pick up and help us understand, how does all this affect our supply chains? We got a lot of stuff going on. And before you go there, one thing Peter and I will also tell you is that, I've told every member here on the call, you should expect to pay 2 to 3 times more to move each and every ocean container for the balance of 2021 versus what you were paying prior to COVID. If you were paying $1,500 to move a container, $3,000 to $4,000. A friend of mine called me up. They were paying $2,000 to move freight from Vietnam. They are now paying $8,700. So you've got shipments from Turkey that are through the roof. David, help us help us understand, what does this mean for supply chains?
Thank you, Mike. Hello, everybody. I'm going to start by focusing on supply chain resiliency, and then I will connect it with what we heard from Derek, Peter, and Mike. Let me start just by making an observation on what we have seen before the pandemic. If you look at the 10 years before the pandemic, you see companies being extremely successful in cutting cost from their supply chain, increasing efficiency by focusing on strategies like lean, like outsourcing, offshoring, and consolidation. But these same strategies that allow companies to dramatically cut costs, increase exposure to risk significantly. And we have seen this way before the pandemic, with events like the tsunami in Japan and the flood in Thailand in 2011, and events like the volcano eruption in Iceland in 2010, affecting companies in a variety of industries, from high tech to pharmaceutical to low tech. At that time, after the tsunami in Japan and the flood in Thailand, my team at MIT developed a new way for predicting the impact of a disruption, identifying potential bottlenecks, but very few companies were willing to use the types of methods that was developed at MIT. Things, of course, have changed since the pandemic. In mid-February, I submitted a very short paper to Harvard Business Review that appeared online on February 28th. So this is before the pandemic is hitting North America and Europe. In 3 days, our paper received 200,000 clicks of people interested in what we wrote. And here is what we said. This is the first paragraph that I wrote in mid-February of last year. Basically, we said the peak of the impact of COVID-19 on global supply chain will happen in mid-March, forcing thousands of companies in North America and Europe to shut down or significantly reduce manufacturing and assembly activities. And this is exactly what happened. On March 17, newspapers around the world reported that both in Europe and in North America, the automotive industry is shutting down. MIT picked up during the week of March 25th and said that the previous week, not only the automotive industry was shutting down, but other industries were shutting down. And so how did we come up with this prediction? I basically applied the same concept that we developed after the tsunami in Japan and after the flood in Thailand, the concept that was published in 2014 Harvard Business Review. In this framework, we have a couple of concepts. I don't want to go into the detail, but at a high level, I want to identify the main component. One is, what is supply chain resiliency? And this is the ability of the company supply chain end-to-end to recover from a disruption anywhere in the business. I'll connect this later on with what we are seeing now. We focus on time to recover, time to survive. Time to recover is how long it takes to recover from a specific disruption. Time to survive is looking at removing a specific facility and trying to answer the question, how long can I match supply with demand without that specific facility, whether it's a manufacturing facility, a supplier, or a distribution center. And finally, performance impact, which is the impact of a disruption during, for example, time to recover on a given performance measure, operational or financial. For example, impact on revenue, impact on profit, impact on lost production, or impact on market share. The first company to implement this strategy was Ford. Here is a simplified version of Ford's supply chain, where you see multiple tiers of supply. You can see the assembly facilities here on the right-hand side. In this supply chain, there are about 5,000 tier one suppliers there are about 50,000 components that flow between the different facilities in the process of assembling a vehicle. And these assembly facilities, for example, the North America assembly facilities, are responsible for about 6 million vehicles per year, every year. And so the question was, where are the risky suppliers and what can you do to mitigate and respond to the risk? Here is insight from the work at Ford. The bubbles that you see here in this figure represent tier 1 suppliers. You can see there are many of them. On the Y coordinate, I'm showing annual spend by Ford at each one of these tier 1 suppliers. You notice that I'm not showing values on the left-hand side to protect Ford confidential information. And on the X coordinate, I'm showing performance impact, which is impact on profit, lost profit during a disruption. When this engagement started, executives at Ford were connecting strategic suppliers with high-risk suppliers. If you look at this supplier at the top, it's a strategic supplier. It's exposing Ford to risk, but it's not the highest risk. The risky supplier are at the bottom right-hand side. That's why the first lesson that we have identified multiple times is that risk in supply chain is hidden in unexpected places. The second, which is directly related to what we see today, is that risky suppliers are everywhere. You hear in the public media that if you just move manufacturing to North America, you are going to increase resiliency. Look at this. These are tier 1 suppliers. They are in North America, Europe, and Asia. The size of the bubble is proportional to exposure to risk. How much these specific suppliers expose Ford to risk? You can see risky suppliers are everywhere. They are not only in Asia. So what are the key takeaways and how do I connect it to what we have seen in the last couple of months? The first key takeaway is that companies need to balance efficiency with resiliency. And I published a follow-up paper in April of last year to highlight the need for stress tests. And I borrow this concept from the financial industry. If you remember, after the financial crisis of 2008, the federal government in the US, government in Europe established stress tests that banks need to take their business through to make sure that they are able to respond to the next financial crisis. Last year in April, I said we need exactly the same thing for supply chain. And indeed, the Biden administration just announced last month that they are starting to take critical industries, the way we identified in our paper, food industry, healthcare, life science, through stress tests to identify whether they will be able to respond to the next supply chain disruption. The first is that stress tests illustrate for many companies the need to restructure the supply chain. That does not necessarily moving completely out of China. That does not necessarily moving completely into North America. A lot of time, it's a combination of global, local strategies where manufacturing in China is for China and Asia, and manufacturing, for example, in Mexico and Brazil for North America or Eastern Europe for European countries. This, of course, varies by industry. And in the writings that I've done on this, I identify our insight industry by industry. And the last highlight that I want to emphasize, reshoring does not guarantee resiliency. And you can learn a lot from what happened in the last 12 months in the food industry. Think about the food industry, the industry like manufacturers of pork and beef. They went through dramatic consolidation pre-pandemic to cut costs. What happened during the pandemic, a disruption of one manufacturing facility created an enormous shortage in the market in North America. So just moving facilities from one region to another or from one country to another does not necessarily guarantee resiliency. That's why we need to focus on stress test. I want to connect this with what we have seen in the last couple of months, and in particular with the comments by Derek, Peter, and Mike. We have seen significant increase in transportation costs, significant impact of the huge increase in demand on the transportation market. Let's look at logistics cost over the last 40 years. This is data that I arranged, collected from the annual logistics report. You can see something extremely insightful. Look at the period between 2002 to 2008, 2009. This was a time where oil price, if you remember, were going up dramatically. In 2008, if you remember, the estimate was that oil price will go to 150, 170, $200 per barrel. It didn't happen, but that was a prediction. Transportation cost was going up, but at the same time, inventory increase. What you hear today about the impact on the transportation market, it's not just transportation. This is everywhere in your supply chain, including your inventory cost, including your total supply chain cost. You can connect what we are seeing today also to the shortage in chip, in wafer product, in chip product used by the automotive industry. It's directly related to a change in demand volume in this market by the automotive manufacturing companies. We can take this in a few minutes to the breakout room and discuss the impact of the changes in the transportation market on supply chain in general.
Okay. David, thank you so much. And wow, I have a question for all the members here. How many of you have applied stress tests to your supply chains? Just out of curiosity, maybe get back to me because there's something else that you're not doing probably. And how many of you have a written transportation spend management plan that highlights the decisions you're making and how your company impacts the freight consumed? We want to make sure the trains run on time, but there are some things that came out of there that I do want to reiterate. And we did briefly talk about the importance of supply chain, stress testing your supply chain. David brought up the example of Ford getting hung up on a part that cost 10 cents. And the thought that your supply chains could get hung up and you couldn't produce vehicles or produce parts for 10 cents is a shocking thing. Let's just finish out here and talk about very briefly, in addition to stress testing your supply chains, the need to create what we call a transportation management plan that integrates with your supply chain. One of the things that we are thinking through here, and Derek, we'd welcome your comments on these as well, and Peter, these are things that you can ask yourself, and it's going to have a direct impact on how much you pay to move freight. First of all, are we a good steward of the carrier's assets? The carrier turns, the dwell time, detention issues. One of the things that Rob Estes shared in the call last time, and Derek has also shared, for Estes, it's a cost of about $90 an hour to run that truck. And the impact of time in advance notice in the tendering process. The likelihood that you're going to get equipment increases with each additional day that you give notice to the carrier that you need that equipment. So one of food companies, I was speaking at Food Shippers, when they went from 2 days to 7 days notice on their customer, giving their carriers notice, they started to get a lot more of their contract carriers stepping up to the plate. The other thing that we say that you are going to be looking at here for every member is you are going to be looking at customer stratification initiatives. And what we mean by that is you are going to determine which you can't basically provide all things to all people at the same time. And so you're going to look at shipment frequency and impact on your cost per hundredweight analysis. The third thing that companies can do that would be immeasurably beneficial is to get control of your inbound freight. There's huge opportunities there, and the use of optimized sourcing strategies to minimize your freight cost leads into the final point, which is packaging efficiencies. The carriers today with dimensionalizers on the truckload and LTL side, with dimensionalizers on the LTL side, they know down to the inch how much freight how much space your freight is consuming, and how, with ELDs, how much time you're using for their truck. Derek, is that a fairly good summation on things that carrier or shippers could do to work better with carriers?
Yeah, I think it's a great one. And I think if I was just going to pick one off the list, that advance notice right now is more critical than ever. The more we know about your plans, not just next week, but what your forecast looks like over the next month is critical.
Okay. One of the things that we are looking at here is that the fallout from code red conditions, and for each member that's still with us, here's a thought for the day. Great supply chains can't happen without your support. And that's why we've said to some CEOs, you're either going to get serious about supply chain issues, or supply chain issues will seriously hurt your organization. You know, we touched on some of those things in our supply chain room, but keep in mind, in today's environment, there is no buffer. There is no incremental capacity that carriers can devote to address these quote unquote mini black swan issues. We've seen labor disputes at the ports. There's a contract coming up next year. California's got a big issue associated with AB5. Not enough time to tell you what that means. We just this week, pipelines being shut down, inclement weather, ship getting stuck in canal, you name it, supply chains are getting disrupted. The tight capacity means that you have to have a plan that addresses the contingency factor. And for those of you that still aren't convinced, think about it in the context of what your competitors are doing. If your competitors are proactively addressing these issues, you need to ask, how will we address them? And can we afford to maintain the status quo and be reactive and have costly solutions, or do we want to be proactive? And so with that thought in mind, let me just, for those of you that are still with us, next week we have a call coming up that's going to address the what's going on in the steel markets. We also have a sales specialist, Ron Carr, but more importantly, on June 7th or 8th and 9th, we've got a virtual summit, the MXN Summit. We have some phenomenal resources that are just spectacular, addressing some really important topics on how you can run your business better. So with that said, Derek, Peter, and David, I want to thank you for your time. And thank you for everyone who joined the call here. And if there's anything else that we can do in the MXN, please get back to us, because we are serious about, like I said, helping you run your business better. So thanks for your time.